The steel rails gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights of Chicago Union Station, stretching endlessly into the darkness beyond the platform. I clutched my worn leather suitcase with white knuckles, the weight of 23 years pressing down on my shoulders like the humid August air that clung to everything in this godforsaken city. Platform 7, train to Portland departing in 15 minutes, the announcer's voice echoed through the cavernous station, each word hammering another nail into the coffin of my old life. My parents stood 3 feet away, but the distance might as well have been an ocean. Mom's eyes were red-rimmed, her mascara creating dark rivers down her cheeks that she kept trying to wipe away with a tissue that had seen better days. Dad stood rigid beside her, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles twitching beneath his weathered skin. "This one's my favorite," Mom said quietly, her arm linking through Dad's. "It looks like us. Not the version of us we thought we were supposed to be, but the version we actually are." Dad nodded, his eyes still fixed on the image. "You know what I realized looking at all these pictures tonight? I spent so many years trying to give you the life I thought you should want that I forgot to pay attention to the life you actually did want." "We all made mistakes," I said, joining them in front of the photograph. "But maybe that's what families do. We mess up, we hurt each other, we figure out how to forgive, and then we try to do better." "Dr. Murphy?" A young man approached us tentatively. He looked to be about my age, wearing a shirt that was just a little too big and carrying himself with the kind of nervous energy I remembered from my own early days trying to figure out who I was. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to thank you for these photographs. I'm in medical school right now, but I've been thinking about dropping out to pursue music, and my parentes, well, they're not taking it well." Dad and I exchanged a look, and I could see the exact moment he decided to step outside his comfort zone. "What's your name, son?" Dad asked, his voice gentle in the way I remembered from childhood bedtime stories. "James. James Patterson." "James, can I tell you something? 6 months ago, I would have told you to stick with medical school, to think about financial security, to consider your parents' sacrifices." Dad's voice grew stronger as he continued. "But my son taught me that sometimes the biggest risk isn't following your dreams, it's not following them. Sometimes the most responsible thing you can do is be honest about who you are." James's eyes widened, clearly not expecting this response from a man in an expensive suit who looked like the epitome of conventional success. "That doesn't mean it'll be easy," Dad continued. "And it doesn't mean your parents will understand right away. But if you're brave enough to be authentic and patient enough to give the people who love you time to catch up, sometimes you can find a way to honor both your dreams and your family." I watched this exchange with something approaching awe. This was my father, the same man who'd torn up my graduation photo 6 months ago, offering encouragement to a young person facing the exact same choice I'd made. It was like witnessing evolution in real time, watching someone grow beyond their fears and limitations through the simple act of loving someone enough to change. James thanked us and moved on, but I could see the shift in his posture, the way hope had replaced some of the anxiety in his expression. Dad watched him go with a small smile. "Think he'll do it?" I asked. "I hope so. And if he does, I hope his parents are smarter than I was." Dad turned to look at the self-portrait again. "You know, I've been thinking about getting back into photography myself. I used to love it before medical school and residency, and building a practice took over my life." "Really?" "Your mom's been encouraging me to find hobbies that don't involve saving lives. Apparently, growing tomatoes and taking pictures qualify as acceptable retirement activities." His smile grew wider. "Think you'd be interested in having a photography partner? Someone to carry your equipment and offer unsolicited advice." The offer caught me completely off guard. 6 months ago, I couldn't have imagined my father taking interest in anything that wasn't directly related to medicine or financial security. Now he was asking to be part of my artistic world. "I'd like that," I said, and meant it. "But fair warning, I'm kind of a perfectionist when it comes to composition. Son, I'm a cardiac surgeon. I think I can handle a little perfectionism." Mom laughed, the sound bright and familiar in the gallery space. This is exactly what I was hoping would happen. My two favorite people finally finding a way to work together instead of pulling in opposite directions. As the gallery began to close and we said goodbye to the last of the guests, I found myself thinking about that day at Union Station, about the young man who'd boarded a train to Portland with nothing but anger and determination. He'd needed to leave in order to discover who he was away from everyone else's expectations. But he'd also needed to come back to discover who he could become when love was stronger than fear. The three of us walked out into the Chicago night together, Dad moving slowly but steadily, Mom chattering excitedly about the reviews she was sure would be positive, me carrying a folder full of business cards from people who wanted to commission work or collaborate on projects. Dinner? Mom asked as we reached the sidewalk. There's a new place in Lincoln Park that's supposed to have excellent pasta. Actually, I said, pulling out my phone, I have a better idea. There's this diner that's open all night, and I've been wanting to photograph the late shift workers. The light at 2 a.m. is incredible, all neon and shadows and stories written in tired faces. Dad raised an eyebrow. You want us to spend the night in a diner so you can take pictures of strangers? I want us to spend the night discovering something new together. And yes, there might be photography involved. He considered this for a moment, then nodded. Lead the way, son. Lead the way. As we walked through the city streets, past buildings that held decades of my memories and toward a future that was still being written, I realized that the best stories aren't about choosing between family and dreams, between safety and authenticity, between who you were and who you're becoming. The best stories are about finding ways to hold all those things at once, to build a life complex enough to contain contradictions and strong enough to survive the growing pains of becoming fully human. 3 blocks away, the diner glowed like a beacon in the darkness, full of night shift workers and insomniacs and people like us who discovered that some of the most important conversations happen in the spaces between one day ending and another beginning. My camera bag was slung over my shoulder, my parents were walking beside me, and somewhere in Portland, Margaret Sinclair was probably already writing the story that would help other families find their way back to each other. It wasn't the ending I'd imagined when I stepped onto that train 6 months ago, but it was better. It was real. It was ours. And in the morning, when the sun came up over Lake Michigan and painted the city in shades of gold and possibility, I would wake up in my own apartment, in my own city, surrounded by people who loved me enough to let me be exactly who I was meant to be. Some journeys take you far from home in order to teach you what home really means. Some take you back to the beginning to discover that you were never really lost at all, just learning how to see familiar things with new eyes, how to love imperfect people with a perfect heart, how to build a life that honors both your dreams and the people who taught you to dream in the first place. The train had taken me to Portland, but love had brought me home. And this time I was staying not because I'd failed at independence, but because I'd finally learned that the strongest people are the ones brave enough to need others, to be needed in return, and to build something beautiful from the complicated, messy, magnificent business of being human. The diner's bell chimed as we pushed through the door, and I raised my camera to capture the moment. 3 people who'd found their way back to each other, ready to write the next chapter of a story that was finally, truly ours. Is it then? I said, my voice barely audible over the chaos of travelers rushing past us with their own destinations, their own stories, their own families who probably weren't falling apart at the seams. Dad's eyes met mine for the first time in 3 hours. They were the same dark brown I'd inherited, but now they held something I'd never seen before, disappointment so profound it seemed to hollow him out from the inside. You made your choice, Ryan. You can't expect us to pretend everything's fine. The words hit me like a physical blow. 6 months ago, I'd been their golden boy, the pre-med student who was going to make them proud, carry on the family tradition of healing and helping others. Dr. Patricia Murphy, my mother, had been a respected pediatrician for over 20 years. Dr. Michael Murphy, my father, had built his cardiology practice from nothing, working 18-hour days to give us the life he'd never had growing up in the projects on the South Side. But dreams change. People change. And sometimes, when you're brave enough to be honest about who you really are, the people you love most can't find it in their hearts to love you back. I didn't choose to disappoint you, I whispered, setting my suitcase down and taking a step closer. I chose to be honest. There's a difference. Mom let out a sob that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest. Photography, Ryan? You threw away medical school for photography? Do you have any idea what we sacrificed? I know exactly what you sacrificed. The words exploded out of me, years of guilt and frustration finally finding their voice. You remind me every single day. But I can't live your dreams anymore. I tried, God knows I tried, but I was dying inside that lecture hall, memorizing symptoms and treatments for diseases while the world outside was full of stories nobody was telling. A businessman in an expensive suit pushed past us, muttering something about tourists blocking the walkway. The normality of it, the way life just continued around our family's collapse, made everything feel surreal, like I was watching someone else's breakdown from a distance. Dad's hands trembled as he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet. For a moment, hope fluttered in my chest. Maybe he was going to offer help, maybe this was his way of saying he understood, that money wasn't as important as my happiness. Instead, he pulled out a photograph, my high school graduation photo, the one where I'm smiling so wide it looks like my face might split in half. I remembered that day. I'd been accepted to Northwestern on a full scholarship, and the future had seemed so bright, so certain. He stared at it for a long moment, then carefully tore it in half. Dad, please? You want to throw your life away chasing fantasies? Fine. But don't expect us to watch. His voice was quiet now, controlled, which somehow hurt worse than if he'd screamed at me. Don't come crawling back when reality hits and you're living in some rat-infested apartment, eating ramen noodles and wondering where it all went wrong. The boarding announcement echoed through the station again, more urgent this time. 5 minutes. Mom stepped forward then, and for a heartbeat I thought she was going to hug me, tell me that everything would be okay, that they'd always love me no matter what. Instead, she pressed something into my palm, a crumpled $20 bill. For food, she said, her voice breaking. When you get hungry enough to come to your senses. I looked down at the money, then back at their faces, Mom's mascara-streaked cheeks, Dad's disappointed scowl, and something inside me hardened. I'd spent so many years trying to be the son they wanted, molding myself into their vision of success, that I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up for myself. Keep it, I said, pressing the bill back into her hand. I'll figure it out on my own. The hurt that flashed across her face almost broke my resolve, but I picked up my suitcase and started walking toward the train. Behind me, I could hear Mom crying harder now and Dad's gruff voice trying to comfort her. I was halfway to the train car when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, hope rising in my throat. Maybe they'd changed their minds, maybe love was stronger than their disappointment. It was Dad, and the expression on his face made my blood run cold. Just so we're clear, he said, his voice low enough that only I could hear it over the station noise. You walk through that door, you're on your own. Don't come back for holidays. Don't call when you need money. Don't show up on our doorstep when this little adventure of yours falls apart. Mom appeared at his shoulder, her face pale but her jaw set with the same stubborn determination that had gotten her through medical school as one of only 3 women in her class. Your father's right. If you're adult enough to throw away everything we've worked for, you're adult enough to live with the consequences. The train whistle blew, sharp and final. All aboard for Portland. I stood there for what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds, looking at these 2 people who had raised me, loved me, sacrificed for me, and who were now cutting me out of their lives like a tumor that needed to be removed. Fine, I said, my voice steady despite the fact that my world was crumbling around me. But someday when you're sitting in that big house you're so proud of, surrounded by all the success that means more to you than your own son, remember this moment. Remember that you chose your pride over me. I turned and walked onto the train without looking back, even though every fiber of my being wanted to run back and apologize, to promise I'd go back to medical school, to be the son they wanted me to be. As the train pulled away from the station, I pressed my face to the window and watched Chicago disappear into the distance. Somewhere in that sprawling city, my parents were driving home to a house that would feel empty without me, convincing themselves they'd done the right thing. The conductor came by to check my ticket and I handed it over with shaking hands. First time to Portland? He asked, his weathered face kind. First time anywhere, I admitted, surprised by how good it felt to tell the truth to a stranger. He smiled and handed my ticket back. Well, son, that's the beauty of trains. No matter where you've been, they're always taking you somewhere new. As the Illinois countryside rolled past my window, bathed in the golden light of late afternoon, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was right. Maybe leaving everything behind wasn't the end of my story, maybe it was just the beginning. But deep in my chest, in that place where hope and heartbreak live side by side, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life. Portland greeted me with rain, not the gentle drizzle I'd expected, but a steady downpour that soaked through my jacket within minutes of stepping off the train. The Oregon city sprawled before me like something from a postcard, all green hills and brick buildings crowned by coffee shops and vintage bookstores, but the beauty was lost on me as I stood on the platform clutching my suitcase and trying to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do next. 3 months. That's how long it had been since I'd walked away from everything I'd ever known, and I was starting to understand what Dad had meant about reality hitting hard. My apartment, if you could call the converted storage closet above Murphy's Irish Pub an apartment, cost $800 a month and came with a hot plate, a mini fridge that sounded like a dying whale, and a view of the dumpster behind the Korean barbecue place next door. The irony of living above a place called Murphy's wasn't lost on me, but rent was rent, and Jimmy Murphy, no relation thank God, had been willing to take a chance on a broke kid from Chicago with no credit history and big dreams. I'd been working at Powell's Books, one of those massive independent bookstores that Portland was famous for, shelving novels and poetry collections while dreaming of the day my own photographs would hang in galleries instead of being rejected by every magazine and newspaper in the Pacific Northwest. The pay was barely enough to cover rent and ramen noodles, but my coworkers were kind, and being surrounded by stories reminded me why I'd taken this leap in the first place. Tonight was different though. Tonight I was finally getting my first real break. The Oregon Museum of Contemporary Art was hosting an opening for emerging local artists, and somehow through a combination of persistence, luck, and befriending the right barista at the coffee shop across the street from the museum, I'd managed to get 3 of my photographs accepted for display. They weren't prominently featured, tucked away in a corner near the restrooms, but they were there. My name was on a little placard and everything, Ryan Murphy Urban Solitude Series. I'd spent my last $40 on a decent shirt from Goodwill and had borrowed a tie from Caleb, my coworker at Powell's, who was also the only person in Portland who knew my story. He'd found me crying into a cup of coffee on my second week in the city, homesick and wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake, and instead of judging me, he'd bought me a sandwich and listened. "You clean up nice, small town," Caleb said now, straightening my tie in the employee break room. At 26, he was only 3 years older than me, but he had the kind of weathered wisdom that came from surviving his own family's rejection when he'd come out at 17. "Your parents would be proud." The words hit me like a punch to the gut because I'd been thinking the same thing all day. Every time I looked at those photographs, a homeless veteran sleeping under the Burnside Bridge, captured with such dignity that it made you see the person instead of the problem, a young mother pushing her daughter on a swing in Laurelhurst Park, the late afternoon light turning them golden, an elderly man feeding pigeons in Pioneer Courthouse Square, his face lined with a lifetime of stories. I wished I could share this moment with the 2 people who taught me to see the world through curious eyes. But wishing didn't make phones ring, and pride was a stubborn beast that fed on silence. The opening was everything I'd dreamed it would be and nothing like I'd expected. The gallery was packed with Portland's creative elite, artists and writers and musicians who spoke in casual conversations about things I'd only read about in books. I stood next to my photographs like a guard, terrified and thrilled every time someone stopped to look at them. "These are remarkable." I turned to find a woman in her 50s studying my homeless veteran photo with the kind of intense focus I'd only ever seen in medical professionals. She was elegantly dressed, with silver hair pulled back in a chignon and intelligent green eyes that seemed to see everything. "Thank you," I managed, my voice barely steady. "I'm the photographer." She extended her hand. "Margaret Sinclair, Portland Tribune. I'm the arts editor." My heart nearly stopped. The Portland Tribune was the biggest newspaper in the city. "I've been looking at these for 10 minutes and I keep coming back to them. There's something honest about your work, something that cuts through all the pretension we see so much of these days." We talked for 20 minutes about photography, about art, about the way light could tell stories that words couldn't capture. She gave me her business card and asked if I'd be interested in freelancing for the paper, nothing guaranteed but a chance to prove myself. As I walked home that night, my head spinning with possibility and my phone number programmed into Margaret Sinclair's contact list, I felt something I hadn't experienced since leaving Chicago: hope. Real, tangible hope that maybe I hadn't destroyed my life after all. I climbed the narrow stairs to my apartment, still wearing my Goodwill shirt and borrowed tie, and collapsed onto my second-hand couch with the biggest smile I'd had in months. For the first time since that awful day at Union Station, I could imagine calling my parents with good news instead of just missing them in silence. That's when my phone rang. The display showed a number I didn't recognize, but something about it looked familiar. My hands were shaking as I answered. "Hello, Ryan." The voice was barely a whisper, but I would have recognized it anywhere. "Ryan, is that you? Mom?" The word came out like a sob. "Mom, what's wrong? How did you get this number?" I called your school. Northwestern. They gave me your forwarding information." Her voice was thick with tears and something else, something that sounded like terror. "Ryan, I need you to come home." Every rational thought in my head screamed warnings. This was what Dad had predicted, wasn't it? That I'd come crawling back the moment things got difficult? But Mom sounded broken in a way I'd never heard before, and instinct overrode pride. "What happened? Are you okay? Is Dad okay? Just please come home. I know what we said, I know what your father said, but I need you here. We need you here." She was crying harder now, the words coming in gasps. "I'm so sorry, baby. I'm so sorry for everything we said to you. Mom, you're scaring me. What's going on?" There was a long pause, filled with the sound of her trying to pull herself together. When she spoke again, her voice had that clinical detachment she used when delivering bad news to patients' families. "Your father had a heart attack yesterday." The world tilted sideways. I gripped the phone so hard I was surprised it didn't crack. "What? Is he okay?" "He's alive. He's in the cardiac ICU at Northwestern Memorial." "But Ryan," her voice broke completely. It was massive. The doctors, they don't know if he's going to make it through the next few days. I was already moving, pulling my suitcase out from under the bed, throwing clothes into it without really seeing what I was packing. I'm coming home. I'm getting on the first flight I can find. Ryan, wait. Something in her tone made me stop. There's something else. Something I need to tell you before you come back. My blood turned to ice. What? The night before his heart attack he couldn't sleep. He kept pacing around the house, muttering your name. I found him in your room at 3 a.m, sitting on your bed and looking through your old photo albums. Her voice was barely audible now. He was crying, Ryan. Your father was crying and saying he'd made a mistake, that he'd been too proud and too scared, and that he missed his son. I sank onto the couch, the phone pressed against my ear like a lifeline. He said that. He wanted to call you. He made me promise that if anything ever happened to him, I would find you and bring you home, no matter what it took. She took a shaky breath. He said the last words he spoke to you were cruel, and he couldn't live with that being the end of your story. I was crying now, 2 years of hurt and anger and love all mixed together in a storm I couldn't control. I'll be there as soon as I can. Tell him I'm coming, okay? Tell him I love him. I will. And Ryan? I love you too. I never stopped loving you, not for a single day. After I hung up, I sat in my tiny apartment above Murphy's Irish pub and tried to process what had just happened. 12 hours ago, I'd been celebrating the biggest break of my career, imagining a future where I could make my parents proud from a distance. Now I was booking a red-eye flight back to Chicago, back to the hospital where I'd spent so many childhood hours waiting for Mom to finish her rounds, back to the city I'd sworn I'd never return to. But as I printed my boarding pass and called a taxi to the airport, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't going back because I'd failed in Portland. I was going back because love was stronger than pride, and family was worth fighting for, especially when it was complicated and messy and painful. The taxi honked outside and I grabbed my suitcase and ran down the stairs, leaving my borrowed tie hanging on the doorknob and my dreams on hold. Some things were more important than proving a point. Some things were worth going home for. Northwestern Memorial Hospital looked exactly the same as it had when I was 12 and Mom would bring me to work with her during summer breaks. The same sterile smell of disinfectant and floor wax, the same fluorescent lights that made everyone look pale and worried, the same maze of corridors that seemed designed to confuse anyone who didn't belong there. But now I was the one in the waiting room, clutching a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago and trying not to think about all the ways this could end badly. The cardiac ICU was on the 7th floor, and the elevator ride felt like ascending into another dimension, one where time moved differently and hope was rationed out in careful doses by people in scrubs who'd learned not to promise anything they couldn't deliver. I'd been on 3 planes and hadn't slept in 36 hours, but adrenaline and terror were keeping me upright. The red-eye from Portland to Denver, then Denver to Chicago, then an endless taxi ride through early morning traffic while I stared out the window at a city that felt both familiar and foreign. I'd left Chicago as an angry kid with something to prove. I was coming back as what? A son? A stranger? Someone caught between 2 versions of himself, neither of which felt quite right anymore. Mom was sitting in the family consultation room when I found her, and the sight of her made my chest tight. She looked like she'd aged 5 years in the 3 months since I'd seen her. Her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, her makeup was non-existent, and she was wearing scrubs, not her usual professional attire, but the kind of comfort clothes you wore when your world was falling apart and appearances didn't matter anymore. Ryan. She stood up so fast her chair toppled backward, and then she was in my arms, holding me like she was afraid I might disappear if she let go. You came. I was so scared you wouldn't come. Of course I came. I held her just as tightly, breathing in the familiar smell of her lavender shampoo mixed with hospital soap. How is he? She pulled back to look at my face, her hands cupping my cheeks the way she used to when I was little and had nightmares. He's stable for now. The surgery went better than they expected, but she trailed off and I could see her struggling to switch from mom mode back to doctor mode. He's not out of the woods yet. The next few days will tell us a lot. Can I see him? He's sedated right now, but yes. He's been asking for you. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Ryan, I need you to know something before we go in there. He's different. He looks different. He's got tubes and wires and machines, and it's going to be hard to see him like that. I nodded, but nothing could have prepared me for the reality of seeing my father, the man who'd seemed invincible my entire life, who'd carried me on his shoulders and taught me how to throw a curveball and worked 18-hour days to build something from nothing, lying in a hospital bed looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever imagined possible. The machines surrounding him beeped and hummed with electronic efficiency, monitoring every heartbeat, every breath, every sign of life. His face was pale except for the dark circles under his eyes, and there were wires running under his hospital gown to machines I didn't want to understand. But what broke my heart was his hands. Dad had always been proud of his hands, surgeon's hands, he called them, steady and strong and capable of fixing hearts that other doctors had given up on. Now they lay motionless on the white hospital blanket, looking thin and vulnerable, and 4-line taped to the back of his left hand. "Hey Dad," I whispered, pulling a chair up next to his bed. "It's me. It's Ryan." His eyes fluttered open at the sound of my voice, unfocused at first, then gradually finding my face. When recognition hit, his expression changed completely: surprise, relief, and something that looked like shame all mixed together. "You came," he said, his voice hoarse from the ventilator they'd removed that morning. I wasn't sure you'd come. I'll always come when you need me." The words came out without hesitation and I realized they were true. No matter what had happened between us, no matter how much we'd hurt each other, he was still my father. "How are you feeling?" He tried to smile but it came out as more of a grimace. "Like a truck hit me. Or like my own heart tried to kill me." He paused, his eyes searching my face. "You look good, son. Different but good. Portland treating you well?" The fact that he remembered where I'd gone, that he was asking about my life instead of lecturing me about my choices, caught me off guard. "It's been challenging. But good. I'm figuring it out. I'm glad." He was quiet for a long moment, just looking at me. "Ryan, I need to tell you something. About that day at the station." "Dad, you don't have to." "Yes, I do." His voice was stronger now, more like the father I remembered. "I've had a lot of time to think these past few months, lying in bed at night and wondering if I'd ever see you again. And I realized something. I wasn't angry at you for leaving medical school. I was scared." "Scared of what?" "Scared that you were making a mistake that would hurt you. Scared that the world would chew you up and spit you out, and I wouldn't be there to protect you." His eyes filled with tears. "But mostly scared that maybe you were braver than I ever was, and that meant I'd failed as a father." I reached over and took his hand, careful of the 4-line. His skin felt papery and cold, but his grip was still firm. "You didn't fail, Dad. You gave me everything I needed to chase my dreams, even if they weren't the dreams you had for me. Your mother showed me something yesterday before the surgery." He gestured weakly toward the bedside table. "Check the drawer." I opened the drawer and found a newspaper clipping, a review of the art opening at the Oregon Museum of Contemporary Art, with a small photo of me standing next to my photographs. The headline read, "Emerging Artist Brings Raw Honesty to Local Gallery Scene." "Margaret Sinclair wrote that," he said, watching my face. "Your mother found it online. She's been following your career, you know. She saved every mention of your name she could find." I stared at the clipping, remembering the night of the opening, how proud I'd felt, how much I'd wished my parents could see what I was accomplishing. They had seen it. They'd been watching from 3,000 miles away, caring about my success even when they couldn't bring themselves to tell me. "I'm proud of you," Dad said quietly. "I should have said it 3 months ago and I should have said it every day since then. But I'm saying it now. I'm proud of the man you've become and I'm proud of the art you're making." The tears I'd been holding back for hours finally broke free. "I missed you so much. Both of you. Every day I wanted to call and tell you about what I was doing, share the good parts and ask for help with the hard parts, but I was too stubborn and too scared. We were all too stubborn and too scared." He squeezed my hand. "But maybe we can fix that now. Maybe we can figure out how to be a family again, even if it looks different than it used to." Mom appeared in the doorway then, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the first genuine smile I'd seen from her since I'd arrived. "I talked to Margaret Sinclair," she said, settling into the chair on the other side of Dad's bed. "She's very impressed with your work. She wants to offer you a regular freelance position when you're ready to go back to Portland." "When I'm ready to go back?" I looked between them. "What if I'm not ready? What if I want to stay here for a while?" Dad's eyes widened. "What about your career? What about Portland?" "Portland will still be there in a few months. Margaret said the Tribune has a Chicago correspondent position that might be opening up soon. And there are galleries here too, you know. Maybe it's time I stopped running away from home and started figuring out how to build a life that includes all the people I love." Mom started crying again, but this time they were happy tears. "Are you sure? We don't want you to give up your dreams for us." "I'm not giving up my dreams. I'm expanding them." I looked around the hospital room, at the machines keeping my father alive, at my mother's tear-streaked face, at the newspaper clipping that proved love could survive even the stupidest mistakes. Maybe the best art comes from learning how to hold complicated things in your heart at the same time. Anger and forgiveness. Independence and family. Dreams and responsibility. Dad nodded slowly. That sounds like wisdom to me. Dr. Murphy to cardiac ICU, Dr. Murphy to cardiac ICU. Mom's name echoed over the hospital intercom and she sighed. I should go. But Ryan, she stood up and kissed my forehead. I'm so glad you're home. We have a lot to figure out, but I'm glad we're going to figure it out together. After she left, Dad and I sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the steady beep of his heart monitor, proof that some things were stronger than pride, stronger than disappointment, stronger than the fear of loving someone who might choose a different path. Dad, I said finally. When you're feeling better, would you like to see some of my photographs? The ones that didn't make it into the gallery? His smile was the brightest thing in that sterile room. I thought you'd never ask. As the afternoon sun slanted through the hospital window, casting long shadows across the floor, I realized that coming home didn't mean giving up who I'd become. It meant finding a way to be all the versions of myself at once: the artist, the son, the dreamer, the person who'd learned that love was worth fighting for even when it was messy and complicated and required you to be braver than you thought you could be. Some stories end with people walking away from each other. But the best stories, the ones worth telling, end with people walking toward each other, even when the path is uncertain and the destination is still being written. 6 months later, I was standing in the same gallery where my Portland journey had begun, but this time I wasn't tucked away in a corner near the restrooms. This time, my photographs were featured on the main wall under a banner that read Ryan Murphy, Coming Home, a portrait of family, resilience, and second chances. The opening night crowd was a mix of Chicago's art elite, family friends who remembered me as the pre-med kid who'd thrown his life away, and most importantly, my parents. Dad was still moving slowly, but he'd insisted on wearing his best suit and had spent 20 minutes that morning making sure his tie was perfectly straight. Mom stood beside him in a navy blue dress I'd never seen before, pointing out details in my photographs to anyone who would listen. The centerpiece of the exhibition was a series I'd titled, Healing, intimate black and white portraits I'd taken during Dad's recovery. There was one of him doing physical therapy, his face concentrated and determined as he worked to regain his strength. Another showed his hands, those surgeon's hands I'd always admired, carefully tending to the tomatoes he'd started growing in Mom's old herb garden, finding purpose in nurturing life instead of just repairing it. My favorite, though, was the one I'd taken without him knowing. He was sitting by the living room window reading a newspaper, late afternoon light streaming across his face, and for the first time since his heart attack, he looked peaceful. Content. Like a man who'd figured out what really mattered. This one captures him perfectly, came a voice behind me. I turned to find Dr. Elizabeth Warren, Dad's cardiologist, studying the photograph with professional interest. You know, your father talks about you constantly. Shows pictures to every nurse, every orderly, anyone who'll listen. He's incredibly proud. He's been my best subject, I admitted. Turns out there's something powerful about photographing people you love. You see things that strangers miss. The past 6 months had been a delicate dance of rebuilding relationships while maintaining the independence I'd fought so hard to establish. I'd moved back to Chicago but found my own apartment in Wicker Park, close enough to visit regularly but far enough to maintain boundaries. The Chicago Tribune had indeed offered me a correspondent position, and I'd spent my days documenting the city I'd grown up in through adult eyes, finding stories in neighborhoods I'd never paid attention to, capturing moments of grace in places I'd previously overlooked. But the real revelation had been discovering that my parents were more complex, more interesting, and more human than I'd ever realized when I was trying so hard to either please them or rebel against them. Ryan. Caleb's voice cut through the gallery chatter. He'd flown in from Portland for the opening, bringing with him a care package from Powell's Books and updates on the friends I'd left behind. Dude, this is incredible. Your parents must be over the moon. They seem pretty happy, I said, nodding toward where Mom was explaining my lighting techniques to a woman from the Sun-Times. Though I think Mom's enjoying this more than Dad is. He's still not entirely comfortable being the subject of art instead of the creator of medical miracles. Speaking of which, Caleb's expression grew serious. Margaret Sinclair is here. From the Tribune. She flew in from Portland specifically for this. I felt my stomach drop. Margaret had been incredibly supportive when I'd explained my decision to move back to Chicago, even helping me connect with editors at the Chicago Tribune, but I hadn't expected her to come all this way. I found her standing in front of a photograph I'd taken of Mom at work, She was comforting a young patient's mother in the pediatric ward, her face showing the kind of compassion that couldn't be taught in medical school. It was one of my more recent pieces, taken after I'd started accompanying her to work occasionally, trying to understand the world that had shaped so much of my childhood. "Margaret," I said, approaching carefully, "I can't believe you came all this way." She turned and smiled, the same intelligent expression that had first encouraged me to take myself seriously as an artist. "I wouldn't have missed it. Besides, I wanted to see what happened when someone brave enough to leave everything behind became brave enough to come back. And I think you found something most artists spend their whole careers searching for: an authentic voice. These photographs don't just document your family's story, they explore universal themes of forgiveness, growth, and the complexity of love." She paused, studying my face. "You're not the same angry young man who left Portland. Portland changed me. But coming home changed me more. The best art often comes from that kind of transformation." She handed me a business card different from the Portland Tribune, one I still carried in my wallet. "I'm starting a new project. A book about young artists who found ways to balance personal authenticity with family expectations. I'd like you to be part of it." Before I could respond, I heard Dad's laugh, not the polite chuckle he used with strangers, but his Real laugh, the one that had filled our house when I was growing up. I turned to see him talking to a young couple, showing them the photograph of his hands in the garden. "You know what the secret is?" he was saying to them. "Learning that being proud of someone doesn't mean they have to follow your exact path. Sometimes being proud means watching them find their own way, even when it scares you." The couple nodded politely, but I could see they didn't quite understand. They probably had kids of their own and were imagining their own versions of disappointment and reconciliation. As the evening continued, I found myself moving through the gallery like a documentary photographer at my own life, observing the small miracles happening in real time. Mom deep in conversation with a young woman who was struggling with her own family's disapproval of her art career. Dad sitting carefully in one of the gallery's chairs, managing his energy but refusing to go home early. Friends from my old life and new colleagues from the Tribune, all mixing together in the kind of community I'd never known I wanted. Near the end of the evening, as the crowd was thinning out, I found my parents standing together in front of the final photograph in the series, a self-portrait I'd taken in our kitchen 3 months after Dad came home from the hospital. We were all in the frame, Dad teaching me how to make his famous Sunday morning pancakes, Mom reading the paper at the kitchen table, steam rising from our coffee cups, early morning light streaming through windows that had witnessed decades of family meals and arguments and quiet moments of love. It wasn't a perfect moment. You could see the 4 scars on Dad's hand, the worry lines around Mom's eyes, the uncertainty in my own expression as I figured out how to operate the camera's timer while participating in the scene. But it was real. It was us. This